Vicky stood by the window, gazing at the empty stretch of road that led to the cemetery. The world outside was bright, almost blinding in its normalcy, but inside the weight of grief hung heavy in the air. The funeral was over, but the sorrow lingered in her heart. Tyler's coffin had been lowered into the ground just hours ago. The finality of it, the physicality of saying goodbye, was still too much to bear. Her phone vibrated in her hand, a signal that someone she didn't care to speak to, had left her a message. She didn't even look at it before sliding the phone into her pocket. Instead, she turned back to the view, feeling the familiar ache in her chest. Every inch of her being seemed tethered to the absence of her son, her beautiful boy who had fought so hard. "Tyler, I hope you know how much I love you," she whispered, as though he could hear her from beyond the grave. Her thoughts turned to Matt, her husband of 13 years. The man who had been absent today, just as he had been in the final years of their son's life. When Vicky had needed him the most, Matt had been somewhere else, away from the hospital, away from their home, away from his son. Even when Tyler's body had grown frail, as the leukemia ravaged him, Matt had found other places to be. Vicky's fingers gripped the phone in her pocket, and without thinking, she pulled it out and dialed his number. It rang twice before he answered. The sound of wind and muted voices reached her ears, a stark contrast to the silence in her house. "Hello?" Matt's voice came through, distant, disconnected, as though he was speaking to her from miles away, not from the luxurious resort in Bermuda. "Where were you, Matt?" Her voice was low, but her anger could not be hidden. "I told you I needed a break, Vic. My parents, it's their anniversary. You know that," he replied, his voice strangely calm. "I needed you here," she said, almost choking on the words. "Our son was buried today, and you were in Bermuda." A pause followed, one that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Vic, I'll be home soon, okay? We'll talk when I get back. I don't know what you want me to say." Vicky's hands trembled as she ended the call. She didn't even know why she bothered anymore. Matt was gone, and even when he was physically present, he had been emotionally absent. His work, his parents, his need for space had always come first, leaving Vicky to navigate the storm alone. Her thoughts spiraled back to their marriage, how it had started with so much hope, so much love. But over the years, the cracks had started to show. She had been the one who had carried the weight of their family, the one who had shouldered Tyler's illness, while Matt had stepped further and further away. She remembered their wedding, how bright and happy they had been. They were young, full of dreams. Vicky had hoped to build a life with Matt, a family that would be as strong as the love they had shared. They had bought a house, a small one at first, but it was enough. Then, things had started to change. Matt's parents had become increasingly involved in their lives. At first it had seemed innocent enough. A little help here, a suggestion there. But it soon became clear that they saw Vicky as a burden, as someone who didn't measure up to their expectations. They insulted her family, made snide remarks about her upbringing, and offered unsolicited advice on how she should run her household. It grated at Vicky, but she had brushed it off until it became too much. Then came the house, the one her parents had bought years ago, a place she had always seen as a safe haven. Matt and his parents began to focus on it in ways that made Vicky uncomfortable. They began to suggest that it was time for a change, that Vicky's family home wasn't right for them anymore. Vicky couldn't shake the feeling that they wanted to take it from her, to claim it as their own. It was an unspoken truth, and yet it hung in the air like a shadow. But none of that seemed to matter to Matt. He didn't see the looming threat, nor did he seem to care about how the stress of his parents and his absence was affecting her. She tried to talk to him about it, to beg him to be there for Tyler, but every time it was like talking to a wall. He made excuses, claimed that Tyler didn't like him anyway. As Tyler's condition worsened, Vicky became more desperate. She begged Matt to spend time with their son, to show him that he was loved, but Matt couldn't see past his own issues. His father's business, his mother's constant criticism, everything came before Tyler. Vicky's parents, despite her father's dementia, were there every day, offering what comfort they could. Her mother held her hand through every rough moment, and even though her father sometimes confused Tyler's illness with his own memories, he never forgot how much his grandson was suffering. It wasn't much, but it was something. Tyler, in his gentle way, always reassured his grandpa, laughing off the confusion, never showing frustration. But Matt, he never seemed to care. And now, at the end of it all, Vicky was left alone with her grief. Alone, except for the support of her parents, whose love and care had never wavered. But even that wasn't enough. She needed her husband. She needed him to be there, and he hadn't been. Days turned into weeks after the funeral, and Vicky's anger toward Matt began to fester. She tried to avoid thinking about him, to focus on her grief, on the overwhelming emptiness left by Tyler's death. But everything seemed to remind her of him. The house felt too big now, too silent, like it was holding its breath in the wake of her loss. Her phone buzzed again, and she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. She knew it was Matt. He'd tried calling several times since his return, but she didn't want to speak to him. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she ever would be. But when her mother called to tell her about a strange letter they had found, documents she had never seen before, Vicky's curiosity pulled her back into the reality she had been trying to avoid. The documents were related to the house, the one her family had owned for decades. At first, Vicky thought nothing of it, but the more her mother explained, the more she began to piece things together. The signature on the document was her father's, and it seemed that Matt and his parents had been involved in some sort of legal maneuvering to transfer ownership of the property to themselves. The shock of it hit her hard. How could Matt, her husband, do this? She was still trying to understand how everything had fallen apart, and this revelation only deepened the confusion. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Vicky began to realize that Matt's absence hadn't been a simple case of neglect, it had been calculated. The house wasn't the only thing Matt had wanted. Vicky's entire life, her family, her love had all been targets in his plan to break free. Vicky spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief. She hadn't expected betrayal from Matt, not in this form, not in the house, not with her family's legacy at stake. But as she pored over the documents her mother had uncovered, her stomach churned. The forgery of her father's signature, the subtle but clear manipulation Matt had been working with his parents to wrest control of the house from her, all while she was focused on caring for Tyler during his final month. Her mind raced. Had it been like this the whole time? Had he been planning this for years? But then another thought crossed her mind. What else was he hiding? The idea that Matt had been planning to leave her after Tyler's death hit her like a wave. She had been so consumed by the grief of losing their son that she hadn't noticed the subtle shifts in their marriage. The long hours he spent with his parents, the increasing coldness between them. Had he already made his decision? Was this betrayal inevitable? Vicky's emotions swirled between anger, sorrow, and something darker, self-doubt. How had she not seen it? How had she been so blind? Her mother was there for her, as she always had been. The older woman seemed to understand, without needing to ask, what her daughter was going through. But even her mother's steady presence couldn't keep Vicky from sinking deeper into despair. She needed answers. She needed to confront Matt. That night, when Matt called again, she answered. "Matt?" Vicky said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We need to talk." "Vic, please, I'm just getting back in town. I know things are tough right now." "Don't you dare minimize this," she cut him off. "You're not going to get away with this. I know what you've been doing. The documents, Matt. The forgery. Trying to take the house from my family." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Vicky could almost hear Matt's mind scrambling, trying to find a way out, trying to make it sound less sinister. "It's not what you think," he finally said, his voice soft, almost too calm. "I was trying to help. You've been so focused on your parents, and I thought." "Don't you dare lie to me," Vicky snapped, her heart hammering. "You've been planning this, Matt. You and your parents. While I was watching our son die, you were plotting to take everything from me." "I wasn't trying to take anything," he said quickly. But Vicky could hear the tremor in his voice, the cracks in the calm. "You don't understand. I was doing this for us, for the future." "For us?" Vicky's laughter was bitter. "You think taking my family's home is for us? You think I would ever want to be with someone who would do this to me?" She was shaking, but she didn't care. Every word she said was like tearing off a layer of the life she'd thought she had. Every word pulled her further from the man she had once loved. Matt sighed deeply. "Look, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. But you need to understand, after Tyler was diagnosed, I couldn't handle it. I didn't know what to do." Vicky's breath hitched. She hadn't expected this confession, not this weak attempt at explaining his absence. "You couldn't handle it?" she repeated, voice rising. "You couldn't handle your own son's illness? You checked out, Matt. You made excuses every time I asked for your help, and now you're telling me you were trying to help by taking everything from me?" I thought, his voice broke. "I thought you didn't need me anymore. I thought you were better off without me. You were always so strong, so capable. I couldn't measure up to that. The admission, raw and vulnerable, hung in the air between them. Vicky felt a sharp pang of something she couldn't quite define. Was it pity? Was it empathy? She wasn't sure. Matt, her voice softened despite herself. That's what this was all about. You were afraid of not measuring up? You were so busy worrying about yourself that you couldn't see what was happening to our family. To Tyler. Matt was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he whispered, I was scared, Vic. I was scared of losing him, and I didn't know how to deal with it, so I just shut down. I didn't know what else to do. The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, but it didn't soften the anger that burned inside her. It wasn't enough. It never had been. You should have been there, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. You should have been there for him, for me. But you weren't. And now you're trying to justify everything by pretending it was all because you were scared. She could hear Matt's shallow breathing on the other end, but she couldn't wait for him to make it right. She couldn't keep waiting. I want a divorce, Matt, she said, her voice firm, each word clearer than the last. It's over. There was a long pause. Matt didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity, and when he did, it was with a finality that Vicky wasn't expecting. Okay, if that's what you want. She hung up before he could say anything more. The weight of it all, Tyler's death, Matt's betrayal, had settled into her bones. She felt drained, empty, and yet for the first time in years she also felt a flicker of relief. This was it, the end of the line. But as Vicky sat in the stillness of the house, she knew that her journey wasn't over. It wasn't just about Matt anymore. It was about rebuilding, about reclaiming her life. About making sure that Tyler's memory wasn't tainted by the actions of people who had never understood the depth of her love for him. Vicky spent the next few months in a haze of legal battles and emotional turmoil. The divorce was finalized quickly. Matt, now stripped of his manipulations, seemed to disappear from her life entirely. The house remained in her family's hands, and though the betrayal still stung, there was a strange sense of justice in it. Her father's condition continued to decline, but in his moments of clarity, he would hold her hand and remind her of the strength she had inherited from him. Those small moments of tenderness, of connection, were what kept Vicky going. Through it all, Vicky found solace in her mother's unwavering presence. In the quiet afternoons spent together, processing their grief, looking for signs of Tyler's spirit in the world around them. It was her mother who first suggested that Vicky start painting again, something she hadn't done since before Tyler's diagnosis. Art had always been an outlet for her, but she had abandoned it in the chaos of her son's illness. Now, it was the one thing that could give her peace. One afternoon, as she stood before a canvas, brush in hand, Vicky realized something. She was healing. Slowly but surely. The process was not linear, and the wound still throbbed with pain, but she had begun to reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. She was learning how to breathe again, how to live without the constant weight of grief. And though she would never forget Tyler, she knew that he would always be a part of her heart, of her art, and of the strength that now defined her. There would be new beginnings ahead, ones that she could create on her own terms. And for the first time in years, Vicky allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future one without Matt, without betrayal, but filled instead with the love she had for herself and the family that had stood by her, no matter what. As she dipped her brush into the paint and applied the first stroke to the canvas, she smiled softly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was hers to walk. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.